Good afternoon and good evening. Thank you all very much for attending this panel today about career opportunities in administrative law for recent law school graduates. Today, we're fortunate enough to have the opportunity to learn from Jennifer Lucas from the U.S. Department of Justice and Sam Weiss from the House Budget Committee. Today, our focus will be on administrative law careers and the federal agencies and departments. So career opportunities in Congress and the judiciary are outside of the scope of this panel. Also, this panel is not a continuing legal education event. The roadmap for today is the following. First, we'll share self-introductions from the guest speakers. Second, I will briefly provide some information about information resources on legal internships in the federal government for current law students. Third, Sam Weiss will present information on pathways to legal employment in the federal government. Fourth, Jennifer Lucas will present information on legal employment opportunities in the Department of Justice. And finally, we'll close with questions and answers. So please feel free to share questions in the chat, and I will monitor the questions throughout and try to collect them, and we'll try to address as many as we can at the end. And to share an introduction of myself, my name is Michael Vung, and I am a 2L at Southern Methodist University Dedman School of Law in Dallas, Texas. And I'm fortunate enough to serve as the student liaison for the ABA's section on administrative law and regulatory practice. Before I turn it over to Jennifer Lucas for a self-introduction, please let me share two disclaimers for this panel. First, quote, "The opinions expressed by panelists are those of the individuals and do not represent the positions of the American Bar Association or the administrative law section," end quote. And second, for the US federal government, quote, "The US government disclaims responsibility for any private publication or statement of any employee. This panel expresses the panelists' views and does not necessarily reflect those of the US government or other members of its staff," end quote. Now, if Jennifer Lucas, please feel free to share a self-introduction. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. It is such a pleasure to be here. I'm really honored to be asked to be on this panel by the ABA Administrative Bar section. As I mentioned, my name is Jennifer Lucas. I currently serve as the counselor for professional development, diversity, and alternative dispute resolution in the Justice Department's Environment and Natural Resources Division. The division is about 600 employees, and my primary responsibilities are covering the career development, job skills, management and leadership opportunities, and all of the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility events and programming and training that we do within the division. And then I also advise on alternative dispute resolution issues, including our agreements with mediators and contracting issues. But here I'm here today to talk about the department's honors program and entry-level opportunities into the federal government. Much like you, who I assume many of you are law students or recent graduates. 20 years ago, I was sitting in your shoes as a law student at Cleveland Marshall College of Law at Cleveland State University, wondering where my dream job was going to take me. And I'd hoped to land a job in the Department of Justice and Environmental Enforcement section, and I was lucky enough to do that through the honors program. So I joined the department in 2002. I litigated cases for about 10, 12 years full-time before getting a management position where I continued to have a small docket of cases and also worked on training and professional development and performance management issues. And then about a year ago, became the counselor for professional development. So I'm pleased to be here and look forward to your questions at the end.
So I'm Sam Weiss. I'm a counsel at the House Budget Committee. First, I'd like to say thank you to the ABA section of Administrative Law and Regulatory Practice for having me. Also to Ann Kiefer for helping to organize everything, and especially us having the honor of being the last event for the conference. It's a big responsibility. So briefly about my history. So actually under undergraduate, I started working for the federal government as an analyst at the Congressional Budget Office. I then went to law school and got a job immediately after law school at the Securities and Exchange Commission. I got a non-honors attorney position, one of the direct hires, and I'll talk more about that. Additionally, I worked on some employment issues at the SEC as a union representative and did a detail at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, where I worked on Office of Personnel Management, which is the agency in charge of the hiring practices for the government. I worked on regulations for that, including working on regulations dealing with the COVID procedures when COVID began and paid parental leave. And this year I started working at the House Budget Committee as a counsel.
Yes, and so today, although our primary focus is about legal opportunities for recent graduates, I wanted to share some information resources that may be helpful for current law students who are looking for legal internships in the federal government. And I'll share 4 links in the chat. All of these websites are free and should be available for all law students. And so the first opportunity is the Arizona Government Honors Handbook, which provides extensive information about legal internships in almost all federal departments and agencies. And law students should be able to access this by requesting the login information from your career services office at your law school. Second, many of you may know of the Equal Justice Works, and they host an annual career fair where they have dozens of public interest organizations, and for today's purposes, last month they hosted 4 federal departments, including the Department of Justice, Department of Labor, Department of Homeland Security, and the U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission as part of their career fair. Third, PSJD is a free online portal that provides listings about public interest legal internships and jobs. And finally, the last link is for the Partnership for Public Service, which offers guidance on resumes, job applications, and interviews for positions in the federal government. And now we can turn over to Mr. Weiss's presentation about how to identify and apply for federal legal internship opportunities and legal employment.
Thank you. So I'll start by talking about USA jobs and federal employment in general. So the most important thing to know about federal employment is that there are opportunities throughout the United States. Only 15% of federal employees actually work in the DC area, and that's not just DC, that includes the Maryland and Virginia suburbs. So there are opportunities throughout the country. For lawyers specifically, there are opportunities in basically every city for US attorneys' offices, for Social Security Administration, and most big cities in the United States will have regional offices of all the major agencies. With that in mind, there's also important to know about federal employment for attorneys, that it doesn't work like most employment people talk about when they talk about federal hiring. There's what's called the competitive service, which most people are familiar about, which there are a lot of requirements. You have to have a USA jobs posting and other things. But attorneys are in the accepted service. So that means you don't necessarily have to have a USA jobs posting, and agencies have more leeway in determining how they want to do hiring and how they want to do posting of jobs. With that in mind, though, still USA jobs is the best way to hear about openings. And a lot of times that's the most important thing for getting about a job, just to know that they exist in the first place. So USA jobs, it's usajobs.gov. And navigating here, this is the page you'll see when you first start. For searching, there's an important few keywords to know about. So one of the big ones is 0905. So you can search by that, and that's general attorney position. So this will be most of all the attorney positions in the federal government that have a current opening. And if you're searching by this or any search you do, you can, just so you know, go here and save this search. And then you'll have the options of getting updates daily or weekly of any of the searches you do when there's a new job. So this is probably the #1 thing you can do. Additionally, on this page, you can go by grade. I'll talk about the grades later, but the most important thing to know is if you've just recently graduated law school, you'll be looking for positions that are GS11, so you can search for that too. There are additional options if you want different codes for different positions. The ones that might be of interest to you are 0904, that's law clerk. So these are jobs for current law students after graduation. I should note though that a lot of times agencies will not use this code. Instead, they'll just use 0905 for all those openings, even when they're considering current law students. Another big one for current students is 0999, and that's for internships with the federal government for law students. Additionally, I just mentioned for anybody who's interested, although these aren't as used as often, there's 0935, that's for administrative law judges, and 1222, that's for patent attorneys. Additionally, on USA Jobs, besides searching for a particular pay or a particular category, you can search by agency. So for instance, if you want to put in the Securities and Exchange Commission, it'll come up with all the jobs that the SEC has. And additionally, you can combine these. So for instance, put 0905, and this will tell you all attorney positions at the SEC. So you can do a safe search if you're particularly interested in an agency. Additionally, if you're interested in a type of law, let's say financial, you can put in financial, and that'll show you all the postings that have financial in them, plus our attorney roles. With that in mind, let's go to specific opening. So this is just one of the openings that would be available if you search. This is one type of way it does it. So this, if you look, is Department of Homeland Security, Attorney Advisor, open continuous. What this means is there's no specific job that the Department of Homeland Security is looking for. This is the way they select for getting resumes for all job openings, basically. And then when there's a particular opening, then the hiring manager will look at the resumes that have been submitted and select from that pool. So the ways you can just see this is you'll usually see a wide range of dates for the availability, and trying to find it on here. Oh, here. The opening and closing date, you'll see basically it's for a year. So that's how you can see those opportunities. Additionally, this shows illustrative, a good way to see the pay scale. This one particularly is GS11 to GS12. That means they're looking for a more junior attorney. Additional things you can look for is the duties and then the requirements of the job. You can look for them for just tailoring your resume. The other key thing to look at is promotion potential. That means how high of a pay you get to in that job without having to compete with other people specifically. I'll go into the specifics later, but the key thing for promotion potential to understand is if you want a long-term career in the government, this is probably the most important thing to look at with an opening, because it's how much pay you'll get basically in the midpoint and as you get further on in your career. With that, here's another USA Jobs posting I just thought would show an example. This is for a specific opening at the FCC. As you see, the date range is shorter. It's basically just for a month. And you'll also see this with a lot of different openings. They'll state that many vacancies may be filled within 90 days. This is just a standard language. Doesn't mean there's necessarily more than one opening, but just if there's a similar job opening, they won't do another posting. And I also wanted to show this here, just that you can see this is a general opening for the Secretary of the Navy, and that there are vacancies basically throughout the country. So just to emphasize that this is not just DC, that you can basically go in a lot of areas in the United States for the federal government. With that in mind, there's other ways besides USA Jobs that agencies post vacancies or even get applications for vacancies because they don't have to do a USA Jobs posting. So here's one from my former agency, the SEC. You can get to this by just going on Google, SEC resume banks. And how the SEC a lot of times hires is that they'll have resume banks on their website, much like you saw with the Department of Homeland Security posting on USA Jobs. They'll do it directly on their website. And you apply specifically to divisions. here's the different division resume email addresses here, and basically send in your resume. And then when there's an opening in a specific group, they'll then look at all the resumes that are in the resume bank and select from there. I will note that because there's no standard procedure, it's not necessarily standard by agency. So I can tell you by example, sometimes at the SEC for an opening, there do be a USA Jobs posting. And if you see both a USA Jobs posting and a resume bank, I suggest generally applying to the resume bank and the USA Jobs posting. But a lot of times they'll combine the resume submissions from both methods. Also, because this is the section of administrative law, I just wanted to point out another agency that currently has an opening on its website, and this is ACUS. They currently have an attorney advisor position opening. ACUS does a lot of great work, and as you see by the GS levels 11, 12, 13, they're looking for a more junior entry-level attorney. And this is also important to note for all these different agencies that additionally for doing searches of USA Jobs for agencies you're interested in, I look at the website of the agency, see if it does have job postings on its website or different resume banks or even ways you can do safe searches on its website. Additionally, talking to people who are at the agency, alums from your law school might be a good way to figure out how a particular agency does hiring. With that in mind, I want to talk about the different pay scales and positions in the government so you can understand that. So here you'll see the pay scale for the DC area. This is specific to the DC area. It'll be different for every different area. It'll be adjusted by the cost of living of the area. So attorneys will generally start at the GS 11. That's where you're eligible for. I do know some agencies start attorneys at a lower level, and you are definitely eligible always for a lower level, but that's where you can start out as just having graduated law school. Depending on the agency and the promotion potential, there are a lot of positions that'll go up, as you saw earlier, to a GS 15. And that means you can get at the same job, start as 11, go all the way at the end of your career to here. So how the scale works is that until you hit the top of the promotion potential, you can increase one grade every year. So after your first year, become a 12, then become a 13, a 14, or a 15. This is not something that's guaranteed though. It has to be approved by your agency. I know some agencies have restrictions on you have to serve a certain amount of time above that additional year to get the grade increase, but it is an option. Also, I know other agencies specifically will almost automatically give somebody a grade increase every year if they're eligible. The second type of difference in pay is what's called a step increase. So a step increase is going from the left to the right within a grade. That is when you do not get a grade increase that year. So you get a step increase. It depends on where you are on the scale. It's either every year, every 2 years, or every 3 years, you go up. And the first 3 steps is every year, then it's every 2 years, and then finally for the last 3, it's every 3 years. The important thing to know about this, especially if you're not coming to the government straight out of law school, is how you can negotiate a federal job offer. There are 2 main things you can negotiate when you get a federal job offer, despite what some people thinking that it's set. The first thing is your pay. So generally you're going to be at a set grade, what the agency gives you for what they think your experience is, but you can negotiate the step. And a good thing for negotiating step is basically think where you would be on the scale if you had started at the agency out of law school. So let's say you have 5 years of practice. So you say, okay, the first year I'd be a GS 12, after the first year 12, then 13, then 14, and then I'd go from step 1 to step 2, and then step 3. So you'd be arguing if you're 5 years out of law school, if you're started at GS 14, that you would be a step 3, not a step 1, and ask for that in a negotiation. The other thing you can negotiate is how much vacation time you get. How much vacation time, or what's called annual leave, is based upon the number of years of federal service you have generally. So after 3 years of federal service, you get 6 hours vacation time every 2 weeks, instead of what most people start out is 4 hours every 2 weeks. And I'd suggest if you start not straight out of law school, you ask the agency to credit to you for any time you have after law school to when you're starting the job. So for instance, giving the example of somebody who has 5 years of practice experience from earlier, that you should say, I should have 5 years of experience credited for vacation time. So in effect, that I start getting 6 hours per pay period every 2 weeks instead of 4 hours. With that, I'll pass it on to Jennifer.
Thank you. Yeah, and Sam's point at the end is a good one, because federal employment benefits are really generous, I think, for health insurance and lots of other benefits. But annual leave is a nice one, and you start out as a new employee at 4 hours per pay period, and that means you get 13 days a year. But if you start out in the example of somebody of 5 years out, and you start out with 6 hours per pay period, that means you get, I believe, 20 days per year of vacation. And after 15 years of federal service, you get 1 day of vacation every pay period. So it does make a difference when you're starting out and you want to accrue some vacation time, especially as you're starting a family, or if you need that travel time for other personal reasons. So I'm going to talk about honors program specific to the Department of Justice. But you should know that for administrative law practice, federal agencies have a really rich administrative law opportunity set. And again, while I'm concentrating on the Department of Justice, it bears looking into all of the other federal agencies, particularly in their offices of general counsel, where they are building the regulatory scheme for that agency, changing the regulations, implementing new policies and practices. And there's a really rich administrative law practice throughout the federal government. The Department of Justice concentrates its administrative law practice on defending their agency's rulemakings and their final decisions when it comes to litigation. There's always somebody out there who's not happy with whatever a federal agency does. And so the United States finds itself on the defensive end of the V, oftentimes in litigation. And that's where the Department of Justice comes in frequently to defend what we call our client agencies in litigation, sometimes in the DC circuit, and other times in other federal court venues, depending on the issue at hand. But I do encourage you to check out all of the federal agencies and their websites on their administrative law opportunities, and I'll turn now to the Department of Justice. So our honors program does hire for permanent positions, meaning they're not temporary 2 or 3 year positions, though there are some components who do have term limited positions, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But for the most part, our honors program is a permanent position where you enter on as a new lawyer and have the option to spend your career there. I'm going to put the website up now. Right here. All right. And here's where we can start talking about the entry-level opportunities. The website for the Justice Department is really comprehensive, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but I'm going to hit some of the highlights and then talk to you a little bit about what makes for a competitive application to the honors program. And I believe Michael is going to put into the chat this website and some of the others that I'll be referring to, so that you can have those for later as well. The honors program is the #1 way that entry-level attorneys come to the Justice Department. Of course, there are lots of lateral opportunities. Typically, attorneys need a minimum of 2 years of experience to come in as a lateral attorney. But for the honors program, you can come out right out of law school, or as it mentions here in the eligibility requirements, we'll go right here. You can be a law student who's going to be graduating anytime between, if you were applying, for example, for 2022, those applications were already due and you would need to graduate by September 30th of 2022. So for those of you who are 2Ls, this is the perfect time to start thinking about whether the honors program interests you, to spend this year getting prepared to apply at the beginning of your 3L year, or really the summer between your 2L and your 3L year. The other folks who are eligible are people in joint degree programs that are doing the joint degrees literally simultaneously. So as it says here, a JD MBA or a JD LLM program. Or you could maintain your eligibility for the honors program if you do your LLM immediately following graduating with your law degree. You can't have more than a 9-month gap between graduating from law school and other programs that would help you maintain your eligibility. There's quite a few details here, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what the all of the different ways that you can maintain your eligibility, but I'm happy to take some questions at the end. But suffice it to say, there are, as I mentioned, being a recent graduate, the joint degree program, judicial clerkships, as well as some qualifying fellowships and term employment fellowships with federal agencies qualify as well. And I should note, for judicial clerkships, those can be at the state level or the federal level. They don't need to be federal judicial clerkships to maintain your eligibility. The list of participating components, there's a lot of them. You name the topic of type of law that you're interested in, and it's very likely that a component that specializes in that is going to be hiring through the honors program. For those of you who aren't as familiar with the Justice Department, we are the federal agencies, the executive branch's lawyer. Many people are familiar with the FBI, which is, our big law enforcement agency, and of course they hire through the honors program, and the U.S. attorney's offices in all 92 jurisdictions across the country. But the rest of the Justice Department also has subject-specific attorneys that do a lot of administrative law work. That includes the Environment and Natural Resources Division and the 6 other specialty litigating divisions, the Antitrust Division, Civil Division, Civil Rights Division, Criminal Division, Tax Division, and the National Security Division. They are subject matter experts in those areas, as well as the Executive Office for Immigration Review and Federal Bureau of Prisons and the like. All right, so how to apply? As I mentioned earlier, the application period is the summer between, typically for students who are currently enrolled in law school, from the end of July through about Labor Day weekend each summer. So for example, this year, the application period was July 31st to September 8th of 2021. Applications are then reviewed by the specific components that you would apply to. And the Justice Department uses a centralized feature, online feature application for all applications to all components. So it's kind of a one-stop shop. You apply with one application, and in that application, you indicate all of the components that you would like to apply to. The online application goes here to a separate different portal, as I mentioned, and it's open to review during that application period. So that's what that looks like. Other key dates, as it mentions here, after the application deadline, individual components receive the applications for everybody that applied to their component. And they have individual processes for screening those applications and determining who they're going to interview. On the prior website that shows which components are hiring through the honor program, it'll also indicate each year how many positions that component is hiring for and which of their subject matter offices are hiring and how many positions those are hiring for. I'll go back and look and show you that here. So for example, the Civil Division, it's a good one to take a look at. They have lots of different sub-branches, and here it indicates in parentheses how many attorneys there are hiring for each of those positions. Now you might say to yourself, wow, what's my chance of getting hired into one of these sections if they're only hiring one? The process is competitive, there is no doubt about it. But that doesn't mean that that you don't have a shot, because the good thing is the Justice Department is doing a great job at diversifying its workforce to make sure that it reflects the American public. So we encourage everybody to apply. We are looking at the whole person and look forward to seeing applications from you and your classmates. Let me go back one more screen. All right. Interviews for the honors program are usually in September and October. And then candidates learn the status of their application right about now, right before Thanksgiving. Offers go out, and then folks come on board the following September. And then you spend a good deal of time with your component, getting trained, having a mentor assigned to you, and working with your litigating teams and your supervisors to learn your new position. All honors program positions are subject to a required background check. And the background check will take a look at arrest records and whether you've paid your taxes and lots of other criteria. And if you have questions about that as you're applying, there are some links to talk with the Office of Attorney Recruitment and Management, OARM, and they can discuss anything specific that you would want to discuss with them if you had any concerns about the background check. But all positions are subject to the background check should you get an offer, and your offer is actually contingent on successfully passing that background check. Now, for most of the honors positions throughout the department, it is just a confidential security check clearance standard. But for the FBI, you do have to pass a top secret security level. And again, the Office of Attorney Recruitment and Management would go through any questions or concerns that an individual might have on a case-by-case basis. So what makes for a successful application? My colleagues and I like to think of this as a three-legged stool. Without one of those legs, your application is going to be on shaky ground. The first is your application itself. The second is your writing sample and your writing evaluation that comes from that. And your third is your references, your professional references. When you apply to the honors program, as I mentioned, you're applying just to the department and specifically the components that you indicate. And you're not uploading a resume, you're filling out an application that's going to have essentially the kind of information that you would put into your resume. And then the most important part of the application are 2 essays. One of the essays is 6,000 characters max. It's pretty long, it's several paragraphs, where you're going to talk about why you think you're a good fit for the components that you applied to. So while you might think, wow, I'm going to throw everything into the kitchen sink and I'm going to apply to every different component, I encourage you to be thoughtful about which components most interest you so that your application and the essays in particular can be targeted to talk about your experience, your knowledge, your skills, and your interest in the particular component that you're applying to. So pick 1, 2, or 3, but I probably wouldn't go beyond that so that it really makes it seem that your interest is being a public servant and you're interested in particular subject matters and you've prepared yourself. Now, that's not to say that, for example, with the Environment and Natural Resources Division, that you have to have a resume jam-packed, or an application, I should say, that is jam-packed full of subject matter expertise. We're not just looking for people who are interested in environmental issues. We're really interested in people who have a commitment to public service and the public good. So again, going back to the call of the question, what's that essay going to have in it? You're going to want to talk about why public service is something that you want to commit yourself to, and what is it about those components specifically that interests you, and how have you demonstrated that in the past and as a law student, or in prior work or volunteer work or the like. So your application really is, or I should say your application is a substitute for that resume. The second question that they're going to ask you about is, what, if you could tell anything to the oops, what happened here? Where did my screen go? I'm sorry. If you could tell the selecting official anything about yourself, what would it be? Why are you applying? What makes you stand out? What makes you an interesting contributor to the workforce of the Justice Department and those components specifically? One other thing to know about the honors program is that you're not going to submit a writing sample unless you are selected for an interview. So if you think about it in this way, if you're not submitting a writing sample right away, then your application, including those 2 essays, is your writing sample. So it needs to be tight. You can't have typos. You need to be thoughtful. You should have other people read it before you submit it. And that goes to one of my, top tips for applications. Make sure that you're taking time to carefully assess what is required in the application, that you submit everything that's asked for and only those things. Because even if you could load up or do load up a resume or writing sample or something else, they're not going to look at it. But maybe as important, it also just shows weird judgment. Like, why are you giving us something that we didn't ask for? So think of your application as a reflection of you, and also those writing, those essays as a reflection of the quality of the writing that we could expect from you when you join us as an attorney. Then the third, or I guess I should say, in addition to the writing evaluation, certainly we're going to look at your writing sample if you're selected for an interview. And most components of the Justice Department now that I'm aware of are doing a blind writing review process. So unlike your application, we get your whole application, and then if you're invited in for an interview, you'll be asked to submit a resume if you'd like, and you will be required to submit a writing sample. And that writing sample needs to be, again, top-notch, no typos, no grammatical errors. If it's something that hasn't been filed with a court, then you're welcome to make changes. If it's something that's been filed with a court, you know, perhaps as part of a clinic or something that you did in law school, we would rather not see changes to something that you filed. But certainly if it's a legal memo that you wrote during an internship or something like that, don't feel that that is something that cannot be changed between the time of your internship and the time you submit it to for consideration for your interview. You are welcome to make sure that that is the best writing sample that it can be. There are some tips on here. I will turn to application tips and checklist that walk through right here. Here's where it talks about the program-wide short answer questions, but also the writing sample itself. Again, make sure that your writing sample is the best reflection of your legal writing skill. Ideally, it's not more than 7 to 10 pages long. Ideally, it has some legal analysis in it and some advocacy. We don't want to see a well-crafted fact section of a memo. We want to see you apply the law to the facts and advocate for a position. That's ideally what we'd like to see in the writing sample. And again, 7 to 10 pages. We don't want a 20, 25 page brief or writing sample, because it doesn't take us 25 pages to figure out whether or not you're a decent writer. We can tell that pretty quickly. So give us something that's tight, that's in that 7 to 10 page range. The third stool leg is your professional references. And here's where this might take you a little bit more time to cultivate than I think often students put in. Professional references are going to speak to your skills, your character, what you're like to work with as a colleague. Do you hand things in on time? Are you reliable? A lot of what people would call soft skills are just as important as your, what people would call your qualifications. How well do you write? Are you a good oral advocate? You know, do you understand the substance of the law and have, you know, good judgment? But your professors, your clinical teachers, your legal writing instructors, the people that you have worked with and supervised you on teams in your internships or in your judicial clerkships are absolutely crucial to you getting an honors attorney position. We don't want to just know that you don't have two heads. We want to know what kind of colleague you're going to make. When you stand up in court and you are representing the United States of America, it's not only a thrill, but we want to know what kind of person you're going to be, what kind of colleague you're going to be. So those professional references are important. And I encourage you to take time to think about who would be a good reference for you. And then when you're putting those 3 names down with their contact information, you want to make sure that they know that you are using them as a reference. I can't tell you the number of times that I've called somebody and the reference has actually revealed that the person didn't know that they were a reference for someone. And that's embarrassing for everybody. You want them to be prepared to talk about you, and you want them to be prepared to know what kind of jobs you've applied for. And if you've just put them down as a reference for your dream job, you want that reference to know that, because that's another nice thing that that reference can say. They can say, wow, you know, Michael just applied to this job and I'm so glad he did because he was a fantastic student of mine and he told me this is his dream job and I think he'd be great for it. I mean, you want that kind of reference. And so you want your reference to be prepared to say that about you because they know what you've applied for, your passion for those jobs, what is going to fit your skills and your interests. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it back to Michael.
Yes, thank you both very much for your presentations today. And to all of our audience members, we welcome your questions and please feel free to share them in the chat and then I can read them out to the panelists. One issue just to start off our conversation is many recent law school graduates may be concerned about the issue of bar passage and hiring. And I wonder if you two would please share some information about the requirements about bar passage and hiring in the federal government. Thanks.
So
Sure. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Sam.
So for direct hiring, a lot of times the posting will say whether you've had to pass the bar. In general, though, agencies do have the authority to hire people who have not passed the bar. I actually started my job with the federal government without having passed the bar. You're hired as what I said, the category is earlier, 904, law clerk. And then once you pass the bar, you basically got 2 attempts taking the bar, so you can fail once. And then once you pass the bar, you'll be converted to a 905, a permanent attorney position.
Yeah, so for the department's honors program, you need to pass the bar within 14 months of coming on board, which I think technically could give you 3 times to take the bar. So let's say you take it in July after you've graduated and then you're starting in September. You could theoretically take it again in February and July. You would need to pass it, know that you've passed by November, you know, about 14 months after you come on board. I think that's standard for the Justice Department. And as Sam said, other agencies may have other rules and requirements.
That's great to hear. Thank you. One question we have in the chat is about the use of artificial intelligence and screeners, computer programs that screen resumes. And would you two be able to share about whether those are used in your experience in the federal government and whether resumes should have specific keywords to trigger these screening programs?
The honors program does not use that. There are humans that look at every single resume. I know that for sure. And I think that is also the case for lateral hiring. I oversee lateral hiring for the environmental enforcement section for the last 8 years. And we actually have no less than 3 people read every single resume that we get in. And I know the Environment Division does that across the board as well.
I'm not aware of a general government rule that prohibits using AI technology for that, although I don't know of any agencies that actually do that. All the agencies I know of, particularly human reviews, they'll usually just say no, be somebody in human resources. So you do want to tailor still what you're writing to the posting, because a lot of times the person first reviewing it will not be in the actual group who's hiring. So they might not know all the more intricacies. You might assume the hiring manager would. And then usually all the resumes that meet the particulars, or if there's a lot of resumes, for instance, sometimes there's over 200, it might be, for instance, the top 100 are sent on, and then the review by either a group or the hiring manager.
Thank you for sharing that. There's another question about how federal agencies consider legal experience from state governments. If an applicant has worked in a state agency before applying for the federal government, how is that viewed?
Well, so for the honors program, you know, typically people aren't going to have worked as an attorney because that would they would not be eligible then for the honors program. But speaking just from the lateral attorney hiring experience, state experience is oftentimes just as good as federal experience. And certainly in the Environment and Natural Resources Division, I suspect that's the case across other divisions as well. The state agencies, you know, are really closer to a lot of the action even than the federal agencies are in some, you know, local respects. So I think, you know, state experience is great.
Yeah, I think state experience is great also because there are a lot of agencies that nobody in the private sector does it. It's the only analogy really is to state agencies. And so that's really unique experience. Additionally, I can't speak for other agencies, but I know especially at the SEC, there's a concern that people are just coming to the SEC to put in their 2-3 years and then make partner at a law firm. And showing a commitment to the mission of the agency is definitely helpful.
That's great. There's another question. I know that Mr. Weiss, that you formerly worked at the Securities and Exchange Commission. And so this question is about, I wonder if you all would have any information resources or that you could share about the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, the Food and Drug Administration, Securities and Exchange Commission, or Federal Trade Commission about, if you have any advice, that would be great.
So the main thing I can say about the SEC is the resume banks. There are some postings the SEC does on USA Jobs, but most of the hiring is through the resume banks I listed earlier. So you can look at the different divisions and apply to the ones you might be interested in. In general, just be like for any job, show interest in the area. When you're applying to the SEC, especially for an internship, the SEC will be asking why you're interested in the mission of the SEC. When you're applying for a full-time job, so the SEC doesn't have an honors program, everybody hired out of law schools for a specific job. And so we'll be asking not just why the SEC, not just why the division, but why this specific branch in this division, what interests you about that job. And there might be people who are great fits for one job. For instance, we have people working on enforcement issues. And somebody might have great litigation experience, that's a perfect job for them. While another job working on writing regulations and investment management, which deals with like hedge funds and mutual funds, it's a completely different applicant who would be a great applicant for that. So also try to tell your resume, don't think because you're not a great fit in one job, you won't be a great fit in another one. I should add that, especially for the SEC and the FTC, they have independent litigation authority. So many of the jobs Jennifer talked about are at these independent agencies. So stuff people wouldn't even think about. So when the agency is sued, for instance, for employment reasons, or even there's the SEC copyright. We don't like other people using the SEC's name or putting out official SEC memorabilia. So we have even intellectual property attorneys at the SEC, who their job is basically to protect the SEC's name with intellectual property.
Yes, and I received, there are two questions about people who may have worked in the federal government before going to law school and then applying for legal positions. And for example, would this affect the grade and step pay scale? And how is this viewed when comparing different candidates for a position?
Well, so actually we have people in my office who worked at, for example, EPA or Department of Interior. Maybe they were a park ranger and then went to law school, or maybe they were an environmental scientist and then went to law school. And that is awesome. It brings a richness of experience and perspective that we value. For pay, it probably doesn't affect it. And the only reason I say that is that typically attorney positions are some of the higher up on the pay scale. And my suspicion is that if you were a park ranger or an environmental scientist, chances are that position was at or below a GS 11, which is where a JD would start out at. If you had a federal clerkship for a year, you'd come in as a GS 12. And if you were coming in out of law school, you'd come in as a GS 11. So I don't think that would affect it. Had you been a GS 13 before, I don't think you would be brought in as a 13, but that would be a question for the HR specialists on a case-by-case basis. But for example, if you were a GS 7, and you applied for the honors program and started right out of law school, you would still start at a GS 11, which is where all the other fresh out of law school JDs start.
So I should add that even though your GS level might be set, you can still argue and negotiate for a step increase. And if you have prior federal experience, you'll automatically get the increased vacation time. And this is actually a question dear to my heart because I started actually at the federal government, not as an attorney, as somebody who had a bachelor's degree, then went to law school, and then came, and I started at the 11 level. I should note that it'll depend on the agency, but a lot of agencies, it'll be, since this is a 905 position, they'll want experience as an attorney because it's like a GS 12, GS 13, 14 as an attorney position. So they'll want at least a year or more experience as an attorney. But as mentioned earlier, there is some flexibility because it's accepted service.
Thank you. And I know we're coming up at the end of our time. And so maybe we can have one more question, or if you want, this can be the last question. Thinking about instead of recent graduates, but current law students, do you all have any suggestions or thoughts about creating an effective application for summer internships?
Well, I ran our law clerk program in addition to lateral hiring. I ran our law clerk program for 8 years, 9 years. So I have a lot to say about our law clerk program, but I would give the same advice. The application process is different. Typically, the Justice Department will have you apply. Many of us use Simplicity or have a direct email inbox. There's lots of different ways that we have folks apply, but the criteria really are the same. Your application is a reflection of yourself. So you want to have a cover letter always that gives a brilliant description in 2 or 3 tight paragraphs about why your experience and skills and qualifications are a great match for the office that you're applying to, and that it's not overly duplicative of what you already have in your resume, which should only be 1 page. And that's paired with your very tight writing sample. And I would say, again, no more than 5 to 7 pages. I'd take 10, but again, we can tell pretty quickly the caliber of someone's writing and whether that matches with your level of experience that we would expect in 5, 6, 7 pages. And again, your references are really key.
I was an intern, summer intern at the SEC, and I did get my job partially through that. And just I know one thing that's almost constantly asked, especially for interns, is why this agency? And if you could just have a good story about that. I know it's probably a little bit different for the Department of Justice because they do so many different things. But like just why the SEC? Another thing to note, this actually is going to be changing, I think, for the SEC over the summer now. But previously we've had unpaid internships. So people do understand that agencies, especially where there's an unpaid internship, that not having an intern there is definitely not a disqualifier for getting a job out of law school.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, most of the Department of Justice's internships are also unpaid. There is a very limited number of positions in our paid internship program. Those are highly competitive and not every component even participates in them. For example, the Environment and Natural Resources Division does not participate in it because we take on so many interns. We didn't want there to be this perceived class difference in, you know, the 1 or 2 people that we could bring on who were paid and the 50 other interns that were not. So it'll vary from agency to agency and even within an agency whether they have paid internships. And while we love to see our former interns apply to our honors program and to laterals, it's not a guarantee, but of course it does position you well to talk about why your experience interning with us translates to how you would be successful in a permanent position.
Yes, that's great to hear. And I see we're at time, and if anyone has any closing remarks, please feel free. But otherwise, thank you both very much for your time, and I want to thank the audience for attending as well.
Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.